Dr. Quillen felt the familiar pang of existential dread nestled comfortably between his second cup of coffee and his third damnation of the day's workload. The cloning complex, a sprawling labyrinth of steel and sterile corridors, loomed around him like a monument to humanity's arrogance. The air smelled of antiseptic and burnt hopes, a fitting aroma for a place where humanity dared to play God. "Hey, Doc," yelled a voice, piercing the tranquility of Quillen's morning irritability. It was Carter, the lab's resident walking disaster and purveyor of questionable hygiene. "You look like you slept in a dumpster." "Good morning to you too, sunshine," Quillen grumbled, not bothering to look up from the holographic display that was currently spelling out his doom in blinking red letters. "And no, I didn't sleep in a dumpster. I slept in what's left of my self-respect," Carter snorted, a sound akin to a clogged drain. "Well, whatever keeps you warm at night." The rest of the team shuffled in, each looking slightly more disgruntled than the last. There was Voss, the geneticist with an ego the size of Jupiter and a personality to match. Beside him was Lynn, whose perpetual state of sarcasm gave the impression she might implode if she ever said something sincere. "Morning, lads and lasses," Voss announced with a smirk that could curdle milk. "What's on the agenda? More playing God or just mucking about in the primordial soup?" "Both," Quillen replied, finally tearing his eyes from the hologram. "And as much as I'd love to dive into existential debates about the ethics of cloning, we've got bigger problems." He tapped a few keys and the holographic display shifted, showing rows of data streams interspersed with erratic spikes. "These," he said, gesturing to the spikes, "are our clones freaking out." Lynn raised an eyebrow. "Freaking out how?" "Think of it as a midlife crisis, except they haven't even hit middle school consciousness yet," Quillen said dryly. "Great," Carter chimed in, scratching at something best left unidentified on his sleeve. "So what's causing it? Bad batch of DNA soup." "If it were that simple, I'd be having a margarita right now," Quillen replied. "No, this is something external. Some kind of interference." "Interference from what?" Voss asked, eyes narrowing suspiciously. "That's the million-cred question, isn't it?" Quillen said. "Could be cosmic rays, could be someone playing space DJ with our synthetic genomes." Lynn snorted. "I'd like to say I'm surprised, but let's face it, Murphy's Law is basically our department motto." Quillen turned back to the display. "We've got anomalies in 50 different clones, all showing the same erratic behavior. And before you ask, no, they don't all think they are Napoleon." "Thank the stars for small mercies," Carter muttered. "So, what's the plan, fearless leader?" Voss asked, his tone dripping with fake cheer. "We split up," Quillen said, ignoring the skepticism radiating from his team like heat from a reactor. "We need to check the affected units, look for anything out of place." "And what if it's something nasty?" Lynn asked. "Like, I don't know, space herpes," Quillen shrugged. "Then we find a bigger microscope." "Fan bloody tastic," Carter grumbled, already heading for the door. "Just another day of poking things with sticks and hoping they don't explode." The team spread out, each heading to a different section of the cloning complex. The corridors were dimly lit, cast in the kind of shadows that made you question what might be lurking just out of sight. Quillen found himself in Section 7G, a place he lovingly referred to as the madhouse. Lines of translucent incubation chambers lined the walls, each housing a figure in various stages of development. It was like staring at a row of creepy dolls. Only these could theoretically sue you for emotional damages once they woke up. He tapped at the console, bringing up the data for clone hash 47. The readings were a mess, like someone had spilled alphabet soup on the genetic code. "Well, aren't you a pretty picture?" he muttered. "Find anything interesting?" Lynn's voice crackled over the intercom, making Quillen jump. "Just our usual brand of chaos," Quillen replied. "How about you? Discover the meaning of life yet?" "Not unless it involves crappy lighting and existential dread," Lynn shot back. "But hey, a girl can dream." Quillen chuckled despite himself. "Keep me posted. If you find anything, scream loudly." He moved on to the next chamber, his eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't long before he found it, a dark, viscous substance clinging to the inside of the chamber like a bad hangover. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," he muttered, retrieving a sample collector and scraping some of the goo into it. "Please don't be alive, please don't be alive," he whispered to himself as he sealed the container. As if on cue, the lights flickered, plunging the corridor into momentary darkness. When they came back on, Quillen swore he saw something move out of the corner of his eye, something that didn't belong. "All right, team," he said, activating his comms, trying to keep the unease out of his voice. "I've found something, and I have a feeling it's about as friendly as Voss during budget reviews." "What's that supposed to mean?" Voss's voice crackled back, defensive as ever. "Relax, Voss, it's a compliment," Quillen said, forcing himself to sound calm. "I think we might have an uninvited guest." "Well, that sounds about right," Lynn replied, her voice a thin veneer of humor over a core of worry. "Let's hope it didn't bring friends." "You and me both," Quillen agreed, starting to back away from the incubation chamber. "All right, reconvene at the lab. I want to run some tests on this goo before it decides to eat through the container." "Roger that," Carter said. "See you in 5, assuming our guest doesn't decide we're the main course." "Comforting thought, Carter," Quillen replied. "Keep that optimism alive." The team regrouped in the lab, a sterile room filled with screens, instruments, and the faint hum of overlooked equipment. The atmosphere was tense, the kind of tension that made you wish for a stiff drink before noon. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with," Quillen said, placing the sample under a high-res scanner. The image that appeared on the screen was anything but comforting. It looked like the love child of a virus and a bad acid trip, all jagged edges and unsettling movements. "Well," Voss said after a moment of silence, "that's charming." "It's moving," Lynn observed, her voice carefully neutral. "Yeah, noticed that," Quillen replied, eyes fixed on the screen. "It's not just moving, it's adapting." "Adapting to what?" Voss asked, finally dropping the mockery in favor of genuine concern. "To us, I think," Quillen said. "This thing isn't just trying to mess with our clones, it's learning." Carter let out a low whistle. "Well, this day just keeps getting better and better." "All right," Quillen said, pulling his attention away from the screen with effort. "We need to contain this. Whatever it is, it's too dangerous to let loose." "And if we can't contain it?" Lynn asked, the question hanging in the air like a guillotine. "Then we make sure it doesn't get out," Quillen said grimly. "By any means necessary." The team nodded, silent for once, united by the grim reality that their cutting-edge science had just become ground zero for something far more sinister. As they turned their attention back to the anomaly on the screen, the lights flickered again, as if the complex itself was shivering in anticipation. Quillen couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the true test was still to come. And that, as always, humanity's greatest enemy was likely to be itself. Dr. Quillen stared at the grotesque blob on the screen, feeling his breakfast do an uneasy jig in his stomach. The complex's lighting still insisted on flickering like a cheap horror movie set, and he half expected a jump scare to leap from behind a data console. "So, we're dealing with space jello that learns," he muttered. "Fantastic." Verlo, the pragmatic engineer who had just joined the team, leaned over Quillen's shoulder, squinting at the display. "I knew my life was missing something, a new kind of nightmare. Cheers, Quillen." "That's what I'm here for," Quillen said dryly. "And we thought clone midlife crises were our biggest headache." "Rethink that," said Kess, the intuitive biologist, tapping the screen where the blob's form seemed to morph and writhe. "This isn't just a blob, it's trying to mimic something, maybe even us." "Great," Lynn remarked, her voice coated in sarcasm like a protective layer. "Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? Shame it's being done by something that looks like it escaped a biohazard lab." Carter scratched his chin. "What are the chances it just wants a hug?" "You volunteer to find out?" Verlo asked, raising an eyebrow. "Hard pass." "All right, jokes aside," Quillen said, "we need to figure out what this thing is before it decides that mimicry includes our credit card details. And we have to do it fast," Kess added, "before it gets better at impersonating us. I don't want to meet a version of me that hasn't had their coffee. Voss, ever the authority on things he didn't fully understand, crossed his arms. We should run more comprehensive tests. If it's mimicking us, it might be trying to integrate, or worse. Define worse, Verlo said. I like to know exactly how doomed we are. Just a hunch, Voss replied unhelpfully. Maybe it's trying to blend in, infiltrate. Or maybe it's just lost and looking for the nearest exit, Lynn suggested. And who could blame it? All right, Quillen said, trying to maintain a grip on the rapidly unraveling situation. We split up, again. We need to check the other incubation chambers and make sure nothing else is trying to go full chameleon on us. Swell, Carter grumbled, already moving. Let's hope I don't run into my evil twin. With a collective sigh and a grim nod, the team scattered once more through the sterile halls of the cloning complex. Each corridor seemed more intimidating than the last, each shadow a potential shape-shifting nightmare. Quillen found himself back in Section 7G, the madhouse, where the air seemed even more oppressive, thick with the scent of antiseptic and fear. The translucent chambers loomed like a parade of eerie witnesses, their occupants blissfully unaware of the chaos outside. Blissfully unaware, considering they weren't conscious yet. He moved to the nearest chamber, tapping on the console for clone #52. The readings were stable, at least for now. But then again, so had clone #47's before it went viral with its new blob buddy. Tag you're it, he muttered, moving on to the next chamber. Elsewhere, Verlo was knee-deep in wires and circuits, trying to rig up a system that might contain their squishy adversary, assuming it didn't decide to eat through metal and plastic like a kid through candy. Anyone else getting the feeling we're just poking an angry bear? Verlo asked over the comms. Or a very confused bear, Kess replied. I'm starting to think it doesn't know what it wants, which is almost as scary. Just make sure it doesn't decide it wants to snack on us, Quillen added. I'd rather not be part of its balanced diet. Meanwhile, Lynn found herself in Section 9B, which she lovingly referred to as the Twilight Zone. The lighting here was dimmer, casting ominous shadows that danced like a drunk at a wedding. She peered into an incubation chamber, half expecting to find another blob trying to do its best impression of a clone. Instead, she found something worse. The clone inside had slightly changed. Subtly, but enough to make her blood run cold. Its features were shifting, like clay being molded by an indecisive artist. Nope, she said to herself, backing away. Quillen, you might want to see this. On my way, came the static-laden reply. Quillen arrived moments later, out of breath and looking like he'd just run a marathon, or at least its space lab equivalent. He stared at the clone, his eyes narrowing. Is that what I think it is? He asked, more to himself than to Lynn. If you think it's a clone trying to audition for a horror movie, then yes, Lynn replied. And it's not even a good one. Kess joined them, studying the data being fed back from the chamber. It's fascinating, really, she said, her scientific curiosity momentarily overpowering her survival instincts. It's like it's trying on new identities, but I don't think it understands what it's doing. That makes two of us, Quillen said, rubbing his temples. Any chance this is just a phase? Lynn asked, not sounding hopeful. We need more information, Quillen said, deciding once again to embrace the scientific method over blind panic. Kess, I want you to run a full diagnostic on that thing. Let's figure out what it's using to mimic us. Already on it, Kess said, her fingers flying over the console. Verlo's voice crackled over the intercom. I've managed to set up a containment field that might slow it down if it tries anything funny, but don't ask me how long it'll hold. Better than nothing, Quillen said. Let's just try not to give it any ideas. Too late, Carter chimed in, breathless. I think it heard me say something about hugs. There's one trying to break out in Section 5F. The team exchanged worried glances. Things were escalating faster than they could keep up with, and the realization left a sour taste in Quillen's mouth. They had to act quickly or risk letting this blobby nightmare spread through the complex like a cosmic rash. All right, regroup in the main lab, Quillen ordered, trying to project confidence despite the growing sense of doom coiling in his stomach. We've got to figure out if there's a way to communicate with it, or at least stop it from mimicking us into extinction. As they reconvened, the team was greeted by the holographic display, now looping through surveillance footage and biometric readings faster than any of them could process. Quillen watched as the blobs attempted their transformations with uneven success, some managing to pass as humans for all of 3 seconds before disintegrating into puddles of goo. "Well, at least they're not perfect," Voss observed, sounding slightly too gleeful for the situation. "Yeah, and neither are we," Quillen retorted. "Which is why we need a plan. Plan A, figure out what it wants," Kess said. "Plan B, make sure it doesn't get it. And Plan C?" Carter asked, folding his arms. "Plan C," Quillen said, his voice dropping to a grim tone, "is making sure we keep our skin intact. Whatever happens, we can't let this get out." The team nodded, grimly aware of the stakes. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a threat to their precious clones. It was a threat to everything they'd worked for, and everything that lay beyond the complex's confines. In the grand tradition of humanity, they were facing an existential crisis with nothing but duct tape and sarcasm. As they set to work, analyzing data and brainstorming ideas that fell between brilliant and desperate, Quillen couldn't help but chuckle darkly to himself. Playing God had never seemed more like a cosmic joke, the punchline still waiting to land. But as Carter aptly put it, if we're gonna go down, might as well go down swinging, and with a decent one-liner. "Let's just hope we get to tell it," Quillen replied, diving back into the chaotic sea of data, determined to find some thread of hope, or at least a good laugh, amid the madness. The firmament of screens flickered erratically, casting an unforgiving light on faces weary from too many sleepless nights and questionable coffee. Quillen tapped at the holographic display, which was showing the blob's attempts to pass itself off as human. The results were hilariously inadequate, looking more like a bad wax figure than anything else. "Well, if beauty's a curse, these things are safe," he muttered, glancing at the others for a hint of morale, or at least a decent joke to cut through the tension. Carter chimed in, "Looks like it's having a real identity crisis. Maybe we should send it a therapist's number." "Do we even know if it can use a phone?" Verlo asked, rifling through his kit of tools with the air of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Probably not, but I'm sure it could fake it better than my last date," Lynn quipped, not looking up from her data console. Kess was the only one who seemed intrigued rather than horrified. She leaned forward, eyes gleaming with a blend of curiosity and madness. "It's like watching a baby try to walk for the first time, except this baby could potentially swallow us whole." "Charming," Quillen said, shaking his head. "We need more than observations, we need a plan." "Plan? You mean besides run very fast in the opposite direction?" Voss added, attempting a smile that resembled more of a grimace. Quillen ignored him, focusing on the surveillance footage. "Look, it's all about patterns. These blobs, they're trying to mimic us, but they can't quite nail the human unpredictability." "Yeah," Carter said, scratching his head. "I guess being a hot mess has its advantages." "No arguments here," Verlo mumbled, still untangling wires. Kess gestured at the screen, where one of the blobs was attempting another transformation. "Notice how it fails when it tries to imitate emotions. It can get the facial structure somewhat right, but the expressions, they are all wrong." "So, they're like bad actors," Lynn said. "Only less annoying." "Exactly," Kess nodded. "They can't handle the chaos of being human, our erratic emotions, our whims, it's alien to them." "So what? We weaponize our neuroses," Carter suggested with a laugh, "because I've got plenty of those to share." "Not a bad idea, actually," Quillen said, surprisingly serious. "If we can confuse them, throw too many human traits at them at once, maybe we can overload their circuits or whatever they've got for brains." "Like an emotional buffet," Verlo suggested, "but with more existential dread." Quillen rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "If we can just exaggerate our own randomness, throw them too much data to handle, we might just overwhelm them." "And how do we do that?" Voss asked, raising an eyebrow. "Hire a circus," Close, Kess replied, eyes lighting up with a mad scientist gleam. We create chaos. We become unpredictable. Finally, Lynn sighed, a plan that involves doing what I do best, being a mess. The team busied themselves preparing for what would be an all-out assault of human chaos, emotional, physical, and otherwise. Quillen had them practice everything from nonsensical conversations to erratic movements, all while bombarding the blob with random data patterns. Carter grinned as he danced awkwardly in the lab, arms flailing like a malfunctioning wind-up toy. I knew those years of embarrassing myself on the dance floor would pay off. Keep it up, Quillen encouraged, unable to suppress a chuckle. Looks like you're having a seizure, but it's working. Meanwhile, Lynn and Verlo were working on a plan to amplify the chaos, a device cobbled together from spare parts and sheer willpower. It's like a giant middle finger to organized thought, Lynn said, soldering wires with a reckless abandon. Perfect, Verlo replied, nodding. If that doesn't confuse them, nothing will. Kess was taking notes, her fascination with the blob's reactions growing with each failed imitation attempt. It's like watching a robot try to understand why humans cry during sad movies, or laugh at their own bad jokes, Carter added with a smirk. Quillen was running through the chaos routines once more, his mind a frenetic whirl of strategies and possibilities. All right, team, let's see if our messiness can save us. The blobs, for their part, seemed to be struggling more with each passing moment. Their forms flickered between half-baked human impressions and their natural, gelatinous state. The mimicry wasn't just failing, it was starting to backfire spectacularly. One blob in particular had attempted to replicate Lynn's sarcasm, only to end up as a twitching puddle of goo on the floor. A for effort, Lynn said, watching it dissolve. But F for execution. Looks like they can't handle the sass, Carter observed, barely holding back laughter. Good, Quillen said, the tension finally lifting from his shoulders. Keep pushing. If we can get them to break down one by one, we'll have a chance. With renewed vigor, the team continued their assault of unpredictability. The blob's attempts to keep up grew more and more frantic, and the once ominous threat began to feel more like a slapstick comedy routine. This might actually work, Verlo said, a note of disbelief in his voice as he reprogrammed their chaos device to broadcast erratic patterns through the complex. Of course it will, Lynn replied, her voice dripping with confidence. We're professionals at being dysfunctional. It was minutes, maybe hours, before the chaos reached its peak. The blobs were clearly struggling, their attempts at mimicry devolving into nonsensical shapes and sputtering failures. They were losing coherence, unable to process the flood of emotions and randomness being thrown at them by their human adversaries. Quillen watched as the last of the blobs shuddered and dissolved into a harmless puddle, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Looks like we did it, he said, awe creeping into his voice. Carter was still dancing, oblivious to the success. Man, I could get used to saving the day like this. Don't, Quillen said, though he couldn't hide his grin. I've had enough chaos to last a lifetime. Never thought I'd see the day when our inability to get our act together would come in handy, Lynn remarked, wiping sweat from her brow with exaggerated flair. The team shared a collective laugh, the tension evaporating like the remnants of the blob. They'd faced a nightmare, armed only with their human flaws, and somehow emerged victorious. Let's not make this a habit, Quillen said, closing the holographic display as it returned to its default idle state. But good work, everyone. As the team began the slow process of cleanup, Verlo sighed, glancing around the lab. So, what do we put in the report? Saved by the power of hot mess. Sounds about right, Kess agreed, still marveling at the data they'd collected. Quillen nodded. Yeah, and let's add a line about how we recommend this method next time we face a shape-shifting blob invasion. Just in case. As they wrapped up their tasks, the sense of camaraderie was palpable. They'd survived by being exactly what they were, imperfect, chaotic, and brilliantly human. And if that wasn't a win, Quillen didn't know what was. The flickering lights of the complex finally settled, casting the team in a warm glow as they headed out, exhausted but triumphant. The echo of their laughter lingered in the corridors long after they'd gone, a testament to the bizarre, wonderful chaos that made them who they were. And somewhere, amid the tangled wires and sterile metal, the complex itself seemed to sigh in relief, at least until the next disaster rolled around. The complex had settled into an uneasy silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm where the air feels too dense, like it's waiting for the other shoe to drop, or in their case, another blob to mutate. Quillen stood at his console, staring at the surveillance footage with the intensity of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. The blobs were still for now, but the monitors weren't exactly reassuring. Carter, leaning against a wall with the casual grace of a guy who'd seen one too many disasters, smirked. Well, we survived our own chaos. Any chance these blobs are just tired of our bullshit? Not likely, Quillen replied, scrolling through the footage. We might have knocked them down, but I doubt they are out for the count. These things adapt faster than a teenager learning to swear, and twice as obnoxious, Voss added, trying to find the humor in a situation that was more nightmare than comedy. He was fiddling with a makeshift device, something that looked like a cross between a toaster and a death trap. Speaking of obnoxious, Lynn chimed in, our systems are going haywire. Nothing like a little tech betrayal to keep things interesting. Kess, still jotting down notes like the blob's biggest fan, peered over her glasses. Systems failure, or are the blobs hacking us? I wouldn't put it past them to try and outhuman us. Let's not give them too much credit, Verlo grumbled, his tone saturated with the skepticism of a man who'd been burned before. Literally. Machines can barely use the bathroom without clogging up. I doubt they've suddenly become hackers. Just my luck, Quillen said, rubbing his temple. We've got blobs learning our best tricks and systems that can't keep a light on. Sounds like my life, Carter deadpanned. But hey, at least we're not dead. That's the silver lining, right? More like a tin foil lining, Quillen muttered, not feeling particularly comforted. He watched the flickering screens, noting a new development with the blobs. Their mimicry was evolving, shifting into something unsettlingly competent. It wasn't just the faces anymore, it was the mannerisms, the subtle tics. They were learning and fast. Guys, Kess said, pointing at the screen. I think they are trying to outdo us at being us. Great, Lynn sighed. Identity theft, the ultimate insult. The footage showed one blob, once a gelatinous joke, now a disturbing echo of humanity. It was crude, sure, but the progress was undeniable. It was mimicking Quillen's frown, Carter's smirk, even Lynn's eye roll. Somehow it had captured the essence of their dysfunction and was using it to its advantage. Okay, that's just creepy, Carter said, crossing his arms. It's like looking in a funhouse mirror, more like a horror house, Voss corrected, still tinkering with his contraption. And we're the main exhibit. Focus, Quillen snapped, feeling the pressure mount. We need to disrupt their progress before they start quoting our bad jokes back at us. Or worse, our plans, Lynn added, tapping nervously at her console. I've seen soap operas with less drama. Verlo, finally putting down his toolkit, stood beside Quillen. You've got a plan for this round of insanity, or are we improvising again? Improvising, Quillen said with a grim smile. Apparently we're good at that. Speak for yourself, Verlo replied. I prefer my chaos in smaller doses. Carter snapped his fingers, an idea sparking in his mind. What if we use their mimicry against them? Make them imitate us doing something they can't handle, like empathy. Lynn suggested with a smirk. They'll short-circuit just trying to fake it, or humor, Kess chipped in. Not everyone can pull off sarcasm, true, Quillen said, but we'll need to be quick. The more they learn, the less time we have. Just as Quillen finished speaking, the complex shuddered, lights flickering with malicious intent. A warning beeped on Lynn's console, something about failing systems, unresponsive commands, and a whole lot of doom. Well, shit, Verlo said succinctly. Looks like the complex is joining the fun, Voss observed, glancing at the flickering lights. How thoughtful, great, as if we didn't have enough to worry about, Carter muttered, rubbing his neck. We've got blobs trying to outhuman us and a complex that's about as reliable as a politician's promise. Keep it together, Quillen ordered, though his own nerves were fraying like cheap fabric. Kess, what do we know about their learning process, besides it's terrifying? Kess replied, not missing a beat. They're absorbing everything, behavior, speech patterns, even our screw-ups. It's like they're building a library on how to be dysfunctional. Then let's give them new material, Quillen said, a plan forming in the chaos. Lynn, how's that chaos device coming, ready to blow their minds? Lynn replied, her fingers dancing over the controls. Literally, if we're lucky. All right, Carter Voss, we're going to overload them with everything we've got. Emotions, movements, bad jokes, the works. Make them crash under the weight of our brilliance or stupidity, Carter added. It's a fine line. With the chaos protocol set, they launched into action. Lynn's device sparked to life, broadcasting an erratic symphony of lights and sounds. It was pandemonium, a cacophony of mismatched stimuli designed to confuse and overwhelm. Dance like no blob is watching, Carter yelled, breaking into a gleefully bizarre jig. More like dance like everyone's judging, Voss corrected, but he joined in, his movements as erratic as his thoughts. The blobs, now a disconcerting mix of almost but not quite human, began to twitch under the onslaught. Their forms flickered, struggling to maintain coherence amid the sensory overload. Looks like they're having a meltdown, Lynn noted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Good, Quillen said, mentally crossing his fingers. We need to keep pushing. It was a surreal dance of madness, a parade of human quirks and flaws laid bare for the blobs to witness. Kess was right. It was like a baby learning to walk, only with the added risk of the baby being a gelatinous nightmare. Verlo, who'd been silent, finally spoke up, his voice laced with disbelief. I can't believe this is actually working. Don't jinx it, Carter warned mid-spin. We're hanging on by a thread here, more like a fraying rope, Quillen muttered, keeping one eye on the screens. The blob's mimicry was failing, their forms collapsing into a puddle of twitching chaos. But the victory felt hollow, the tension palpable as the complex's systems continued their downward spiral. It wasn't just the blobs they had to worry about now. It was their own home turning against them. How's the cleanup crew? Voss asked, his breath coming in short gasps. Because I doubt anyone's keen on mopping up blob soup. We'll worry about that later, Quillen replied, focusing on the here and now. First, we survive. The team's efforts were paying off, the blobs unable to maintain their cohesion amid the relentless storm of human unpredictability. It was a testament to their resilience, or maybe just their sheer desperation. Looks like they're on their last legs, Kessa observed, though she didn't look away from her notes. If blobs had legs, good, Quillen said, though he couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Let's finish this. Just then the lights dimmed, a low rumble echoing through the complex. The systems were failing, the entire place teetering on the brink of collapse. Any chance that's the sound of success? Carter asked, though he already knew the answer. More like the sound of impending disaster, Verlo replied, his gaze fixed on the erratic monitors. Just another day at the office, Lynn said, forcing a grin. We've dealt with worse. Yeah, Quillen said, his voice steely with resolve. But let's not make worse our new normal. The team's laughter was tinged with nerves, each of them fully aware of how close they were to the edge. They'd won a battle, sure, but the war wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the last of the blobs dissolved, their forms unable to withstand the assault of human chaos, the team took a collective breath. They'd done it. They'd survived, if only just. But as the complex groaned around them, its systems flickering with a malevolent unpredictability, Quillen knew their fight was far from finished. All right, he said, looking at his team, his friends, his partners in chaos. Let's get to work. We've got a complex to save. And as they set to work, the complex echoed with the sounds of humanity, imperfect, irreverent, indomitable. They were flawed, yes, but they were also relentless, and that was their greatest strength. The cloning complex was one missed maintenance check away from imploding, and if the groaning walls and flickering lights were any indication, that maintenance check wasn't coming anytime soon. Doctor. Quillen stood there, surrounded by reminders of humanity's hubris and wondering if they'd finally managed to turn their own genius into a suicide pact. Quillen, Carter said, leaning against a console with a casual nonchalance that screamed, "I'm pretending I'm not scared shitless." "Got a minute? I'd love to say no," Quillen replied, not taking his eyes off the surveillance footage. The blobs were having a midlife crisis, but unlike humans, they didn't have the luxury of buying a sports car and pretending it was all okay. Carter cleared his throat, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Some of the team think you might be leading us into a black hole. Figuratively, not literally. Although, at this point, who the hell knows? Thanks for the pep talk," Quillen said, finally turning to look at Carter. "I'll add avoid black holes to my list. Right after keep breathing and don't die. Just trying to keep it real," Carter said, smirking. "But seriously, they're getting good at this mimicry thing." "Too good. Yeah, I noticed," Quillen muttered, rubbing his temples. The blobs were no longer just bad actors in a sci-fi horror flick. They were starting to nail the roles, and that was scarier than anything Hollywood could cook up. Lynn appeared, her usual demeanor of sarcasm replaced with a rare hint of seriousness. "Systems are acting like they are on strike. We're losing control faster than a drunk at a karaoke bar. We need to stop those blobs before they start telling jokes as bad as ours," Quillen said, scanning the room. Voss was still fiddling with his gadget, probably trying to invent the galaxy's first self-destructing toaster. "Thank God they haven't figured out how to do stand-up," Lynn quipped, joining Carter. "That'd be our apocalypse." Verlo walked over, shaking his head as if trying to dislodge a particularly stubborn thought. "We're a walking disaster zone, Quillen. Are we sure we're the good guys in this scenario? Quillen shot back. "I'm not even sure we're the guys in charge." Kess scribbled furiously in her notebook, a look of half amusement, half terror on her face. "If the blobs write a biography about us, it's going straight to the fiction section. Non-fiction's too optimistic for this mess," Voss added, not looking up from his contraption. "All right, enough with the motivational speeches," Quillen said, clapping his hands like a coach at halftime. "We know what we're dealing with. Let's focus on not getting killed." The complex shuddered again, a low groan echoing through the corridors like the death rattle of 1,000 machines with hangovers. Quillen's eyes darted back to the screens, where the blobs were definitely up to something, their forms shifting with an unsettling fluidity. "Okay, anyone got a real plan?" Carter asked, his tone a mix of sarcasm and genuine curiosity. Quillen hesitated, the weight of the question hanging heavy. "We improvise," he said finally. "We hit them with everything we've got and hope it's enough to keep them from turning into better versions of us. Is that really a plan?" Lynn asked, eyebrow raised. "It's the best bad idea we've got," Quillen said. "And given our track record, it's probably the only one." The team exchanged glances, each knowing the stakes but unwilling to back down. They'd been through too much together to let a bunch of blobs outplay them at their own game. "Let's get to it," Carter said, pushing off the console with a sigh. "If we're going down swinging, or at least flailing," Voss corrected, finally setting his device aside. "I'm not picky." Quillen couldn't help but smile at that. Despite everything, there was something comforting about facing the end with a group of misfits who couldn't help but make a joke out of it all. "All right, team," he said, gathering them close. "Let's show these blobs what real dysfunction looks like." With renewed determination, they sprang into action. Quillen couldn't shake the feeling that this was their last stand, that if this didn't work, they'd be nothing more than an anecdote in some alien's history book. They hit the blobs with everything they had: chaos, sarcasm, a symphony of human flaws that no amount of mimicry could replicate. It was messy, it was desperate, and it was glorious in its own twisted way. But even as the blobs struggled to keep up, their forms flickering and failing, Quillen knew the victory was temporary. They hadn't won, not really. They'd bought themselves time, nothing more. And time, as it turned out, was the most valuable commodity in the universe. Anyone else feel like a hamster on a wheel? Carter asked as they regrouped, breathless and battered. Only if the wheel's on fire, Lynn replied, wiping sweat from her brow. We're not done yet, Quillen reminded them, his voice steady despite the chaos. Let's not get too comfortable, Verlo, ever the skeptic, grumbled under his breath. Comfortable? I'll settle for not being dead. Small victories, Kess said, her smile wry and weary. Quillen glanced at the screens again, his chest tightening at the sight of the blobs regrouping, their forms shifting with renewed determination. They were learning, evolving, and it was only a matter of time before they'd surpass their creators. We need to do better, he said, more to himself than the others. We need to think like them. Great, Voss said, rolling his eyes. Anyone got a blob brain handy? Not exactly, Quillen admitted, but maybe we can fake it. Carter snorted. Fake it till you make it. That's our plan. It's gotten us this far, Quillen pointed out. Let's just hope it gets us a little further. The complex groaned again, a reminder that they were on borrowed time. Quillen knew they couldn't keep this up indefinitely, but what choice did they have? They were in too deep to turn back now. Hey, Quillen, Lynn said, nudging him with her elbow. Remember when we thought the worst part of this job was the paperwork? Yeah, Quillen replied, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Those were the good old days. Here's to making it to the next round of good old days, Carter said, raising an imaginary glass. To survival, Verlo added, though his expression was more grim than hopeful. To not dying, Voss said, summing up their collective sentiment nicely. Quillen nodded, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie despite the chaos. They were a ragtag bunch, but they were his ragtag bunch, and that meant something. All right, team, he said, steeling himself against the uncertainty. Let's get back in there and show them what we're made of. It wasn't a battle cry, not exactly, but it was enough to rally the troops, enough to remind them that they were still in this fight, even if they were barely holding on. And as they turned their attention back to the task at hand, Quillen couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going, enough to keep the hope alive. For now, at least, they were still in the game, and as long as they were in the game, they had a shot at winning. The cloning complex sighed like an asthmatic dragon as Quillen and his motley crew huddled around a data console. The blobs had been regrouping on the surveillance footage, looking like they'd taken a crash course at the Keanu Reeves School of Acting. Quillen flicked off the screen with the kind of irritation usually reserved for telemarketers. We've got to think outside the box, he began, already regretting the management speak. Or at least outside the blob. Maybe we should throw them a surprise party, Voss suggested, his grin a smirk as he tinkered with his suicidal toaster contraption. Nothing says human like awkward social gatherings. That might just scare them off, honestly, Carter chimed in, leaning against a console, his eternal aura of faux calmness masking the inner chaos of his mind. Kess, who had been scribbling away in her notebook like a teenager caught in math class, paused and looked up. What if, hear me out, we use their own game against them? Are you suggesting we mimic the mimics? Verlo asked, skepticism practically tattooed on his forehead. No, Kess said, waving her pen like a wand. We give them something they can't mimic. Human unpredictability, unpredictability. Lynn repeated, a brow arched high enough to suggest she was considering a career change to circus performer. Like making life decisions based on what a magic 8-ball says if it works. Kess shrugged. We need to confuse them. They haven't got emotions down yet. They're still trying to imitate the kind of crying you'd see in a soap opera. Quillen nodded, a glimmer of a plan forming in the cesspool of chaos that was his mind. They can't handle real human emotion. They're like toddlers trying to pilot a starship with crayons. So what's the plan, Captain Chaos? Carter asked, eyeing Quillen with a mix of amusement and dread. We hit them where it hurts, Quillen said, determination settling over his features like a poorly fitted hat. We weaponize our emotions. Voss whistled low, his eyes lighting up with mischief. First time I've heard of feelings doing something useful, think about it, Quillen insisted, warming to his theme. They can't replicate what they can't understand. Our emotional bonds, our unpredictability, that's our secret weapon, emotions as weapons. Lynn said, eyes narrowing skeptically. Wouldn't that just mean a lot of yelling and crying? Exactly, Kess said, jabbing a finger at a diagram she'd been sketching. We amplify our emotional responses. We show them real chaos. It's like giving them a front row seat to reality TV. Quillen watched as the team absorbed the idea, each of them wrestling with the concept like a slippery eel. We need something big. Something they can't predict because, hell, even we can't predict it. Well, Verlo said, scratching his chin. We've got a whole complex here. It's basically a giant mood ring. Surely we can use it, use the complex itself. Carter echoed, glancing around at the misfiring consoles and flickering lights. Seems like fighting fire with a flamethrower or like trying to drown a fish, Voss added, not missing a beat. Exactly, Quillen said, clapping his hands together. We need to make this place come alive. Use it to amplify our unpredictability. Great, Lynn muttered. We're turning the complex into a haunted house. What next? We start charging admission. Look, we're short on options, Quillen said, exasperated but hopeful. If we can make the complex unpredictable enough, it might throw the blobs off their game. If it doesn't kill us first, Verlo pointed out, ever the optimist. Details, Quillen shot back. So what do you say? We give the blobs a show they'll never forget. Sounds like a plan as long as we don't end up as the opening act, Carter said, running a hand through his hair in a futile attempt at composure. Let's do it, Lynn agreed, her usual sarcasm momentarily softened by actual determination. Show them we're more than just a bad imitation. Quillen nodded, feeling the rush of adrenaline that only comes from knowing you're about to do something incredibly stupid. All right, team. Let's make things interesting. The complex around them groaned like a teenager asked to do chores, but they set to work with a feverish energy, each of them an artist adding to the grand masterpiece of chaos. Voss fiddled with his device, now looking suspiciously like it could either explode or make toast. This should be fun, he muttered, tweaking a wire with a screwdriver. Fun's one word for it, Kess remarked, jotting down the latest developments in her notebook. There's also stupid, reckless, and potentially fatal. Hey, we live for danger, Carter said with a grin that suggested he'd rather live for a new pair of clean underwear. The team scattered throughout the complex, each playing their part in the grand symphony of destruction. Lights flickered, consoles beeped erratically, and somewhere in the distance a siren wailed like a drunk opera singer. All right, folks, Quillen said over the comms, trying to sound braver than he felt. Time to give this place a heart attack. The chaos was immediate and glorious. Machines whirred to life, their circuits doing the electronic equivalent of a midlife crisis. Doors opened and shut of their own accord, making the complex seem like it was playing a particularly aggressive game of peekaboo. Someone remind me why we didn't go into accounting, Carter said, ducking under a sparking wire. Numbers don't scream when they malfunction, Lynn replied, wrestling with a console that had decided its new purpose was to beep incessantly. The blobs, caught in the throes of their own confusion, flailed about, their forms shifting like bad CGI. They couldn't keep up with the raw, unfiltered chaos that was human emotion plus machinery gone haywire. We're doing it, Kess yelled over the din, her voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. They're losing it, let's keep it up. Quillen urged, glancing at the surveillance footage. The blobs were struggling, their mimicry faltering as they tried to adapt to the unpredictable madness around them. Never thought I'd see the day where our dysfunction was an asset, Verlo grumbled, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of hope. This is what we're made for, Quillen said, a manic grin spreading across his face. Chaos, pure, unadulterated human chaos. The words were barely out of his mouth when an alarm blared, louder and more insistent than before. The complex shuddered violently, sending a shiver through the team. Guys, Voss said, eyeing his makeshift device which was now smoking ominously. I think we might have overdone it. Define overdone, Carter said, looking around for something that wasn't on the verge of exploding. Overdone as in we might blow up, Voss replied, already tinkering to avert disaster. Well, that's new, Lynn said dryly, grabbing a fire extinguisher and aiming it at a sparking console. Anyone else got a plan? Keep them unbalanced, Quillen said, his mind racing for alternatives. We've got to maintain the chaos without letting the complex take us with it. Is that even possible? Kess asked, clutching her notebook like a lifeline. Sure, Quillen said, doing his best to sound confident. If you believe in miracles, miracles are for suckers, Verlo muttered, but he was already moving to help Voss stabilize the device. Let's just try not to die, all right, Carter said, ever the pragmatist. Quillen nodded, his heart pounding in time with the thrum of the complex. All right, team. Let's show these blobs we're more than just unpredictable. We're unstoppable. The team worked with a feverish determination, each of them a cog in the chaotic machine they'd created. And as the blobs struggled to keep up, their forms flickering and failing, Quillen couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They might just pull this off. Or at least go down trying. The cloning complex had all the ambience of a haunted house thrown together by a group of particularly disgruntled teenagers. Every corner was alive with chaos, flickering lights, consoles beeping out of sync, and the occasional gust of smoke from Voss's toaster from hell. As Quillen looked around, he couldn't help but think they'd either just saved humanity or doomed it to a slapstick end. Right, Quillen said, trying to sound like a man in control rather than one holding onto sanity by a thread. Let's keep this up. More chaos means more chances we can force these blobs to reveal themselves. Are we sure they're not just us on a bad day? Carter mused, sidestepping a wire that dangled like a drunk dancer at a wedding. I mean, who hasn't had a moment where they feel like a shapeless mass of confusion? You're describing Monday mornings, Kess interjected, scribbling furiously in her notebook. And at least we're more consistent with our chaos. Speak for yourself, Verlo grunted, smacking a console back to life. My chaos is a work of art or not, we need to crank it up, Quillen said, adjusting a flickering console with the finesse of a man trying to defuse a bomb while blindfolded. We're aiming for concert-level madness, not an easy listening playlist. Got it, Lynn said, and with a theatrical flourish, she flipped a switch that sent a shower of sparks raining down. I'd say that's a good start. The blobs, bless their slimy hearts, were floundering. They slithered around the complex, attempting to mimic human movements but ending up looking like drunk robots at a disco. Their forms flickered, changing from one ill-conceived attempt at a human to another. It was like watching a slideshow of bad impersonations. Look at them go, Voss chuckled, narrowly avoiding an electric shock from his contraption. It's like they're doing an interpretive dance about societal collapse. Hell, it might even be an improvement over some of the stuff I've seen on the entertainment channels, Lynn said, glancing at the blobs with a smirk. At least they're trying and failing, Kess pointed out. But that's good for us. Yeah, let's just make sure we're not the ones who fail next, Quillen reminded them, eyeing a blob that had settled on a form resembling a particularly unflattering sculpture of himself. Now that's just rude. Think it's a compliment, Verlo said dryly. They're trying to capture your essence. If my essence is that of a melted action figure, I'm in trouble, Quillen shot back, but there was no denying the thrill of seeing the blob struggle to adapt to their unpredictable onslaught. Okay, folks, Quillen continued, clapping his hands to draw attention. Time for Phase 2. We need to mislead them, get them to expose their weak points. And how do you suggest we do that? Carter asked, his calm demeanor masking the fact that he was probably close to losing his mind. Simple, Quillen grinned, flashing an expression that suggested a man on the edge of genius or insanity. We lie through our teeth, lie. Kess raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Exactly, Quillen nodded. If they're trying to imitate us, they need to believe what they see. So we feed them a load of nonsense. Sounds like a normal day on the internet, Voss said with a chuckle. Start spreading misinformation, Quillen directed, embracing the madness of their plan. Let's see if we can't get them to chase their own tails. That might just work, Lynn said, warming to the idea. We'll have them so confused they won't know if they're coming or going. Let's hope they figure it out before we blow the place up, Verlo chimed in, casting a wary eye on their malfunctioning systems. Details Quillen dismissed with a wave. Remember, we're the masters of chaos. If we're going out, we're taking these blobs with us. The team set to work, spreading false information like they were on some cosmic prank show. They talked in riddles and contradictions, each member spouting nonsense that would make a politician blush. As the blobs absorbed their words, their attempts at human forms grew even more erratic. One moment they'd resemble a distorted version of Carter, the next they'd morph into a twisted parody of Lynn. Each transformation was accompanied by gestures as if they were trying to mime the essence of a headache. We're getting to them, Kess said, watching the blobs struggle to maintain a consistent form. They're about as stable as a politician's promise, Voss noted, grinning at his own joke. Keep it up, Quillen urged, feeling the momentum shift in their favor. We need them to break, show us what they really are. The complex shuddered again, a reminder of the ticking time bomb they were dancing around. But as long as they kept the blobs off balance, it was a risk worth taking. Think my toaster's about to make its grand exit, Voss commented, eyeing his invention which was now sparking like it had a personal vendetta. Just make sure it takes the blobs with it, Quillen said, not entirely joking. The blobs were nearing their breaking point, their efforts to mimic human emotions devolving into something that looked like a child's angry crayon drawing. They couldn't keep up with the barrage of contradictions and fabrications hurled their way. Almost there, Kess urged, her voice tinged with excitement. Just a little more. The final push came when Carter, in a moment of inspired insanity, began reciting poetry. It wasn't good poetry, mind you, but the kind that would make a high school English teacher sigh. Still, it did the trick. The blobs, already teetering on the edge of coherence, finally faltered. Their forms flickered, and for a brief moment they revealed their true nature, an amorphous shifting mass that had no place in the human world. There, Verlo shouted, pointing at the surveillance feed. That's it. That's their real form. Now, Quillen yelled, rallying his crew. We hit them with everything we've got. The team, fueled by a mix of adrenaline and desperation, unleashed their final assault. They directed the malfunctioning systems to overload, targeting the blobs with a barrage of electrical surges and feedback loops designed to disrupt their mimicry. Come on, Voss muttered, his fingers flying across the controls as he coaxed his toaster contraption into action. The complex itself seemed to join in the fight, its failing systems creating a cacophony of light and sound that resonated through every corridor. It was a symphony of destruction, orchestrated by the very people who had once considered themselves caretakers of this place. Think we got them, Lynn shouted, shielding her eyes against the blinding light that filled the room. The blobs, unable to withstand the onslaught, began to disintegrate. Their forms unraveled, leaving behind nothing but a faint shimmer in the air, a testament to their brief, chaotic existence. Did we do it? Carter asked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Looks like it, Quillen said, his heart pounding with the thrill of victory. They couldn't handle the truth, or the lies, Kess added with a smirk, finally putting down her notebook. The team stood amidst the wreckage, their bodies exhausted but their spirits buoyed by success. The complex, though battered and bruised, was theirs once more. We did it, Verlo said, a rare note of satisfaction in his voice. We actually did it, and all it took was a healthy dose of lunacy, Voss remarked, patting his toaster like a proud parent. So what now? Lynn asked, looking at the ruins of their once orderly world. Now, Quillen echoed, a smile playing on his lips. Now we clean up this mess and figure out what to do with all these malfunctioning systems. Sounds like the kind of job that should come with hazard pay, Carter quipped, stretching his tired limbs. Or at least a strong drink, Kess suggested, eyeing the chaos with weary eyes. Drinks are on me, Quillen announced, feeling a rare moment of camaraderie with his crew. We've earned it. As they began the long process of repairing the complex, the memory of the blobs lingered, a reminder of the unpredictable chaos they'd faced and conquered. Think we'll ever see something like that again? Verlo asked as they worked. Maybe, Quillen replied, shrugging. But if we do, at least we'll know we can handle it. Wouldn't count on it, Voss said, grinning. Next time might involve a death ray toaster. Sounds like an upgrade, Carter laughed, and the team's laughter echoed through the complex, a testament to their resilience. They'd faced down an enemy that could mimic their forms but not their spirit, and in the end that had made all the difference. Here's to us, Quillen said, raising an imaginary glass. The unpredictable, unstoppable force of human chaos. And as they clinked their imaginary drinks, they knew that whatever the galaxy threw at them next, they'd be ready. The silence after the storm was louder than any explosion the cloning complex had endured. It was the kind of silence that, like an old joke, lingered in the air, daring you to laugh or cry, and not particularly caring which you chose. It was also the kind of silence that left you wondering if you'd finally snapped. Okay, let's take stock, Quillen announced, though his voice had the beleaguered quality of someone who'd just finished a marathon only to find out the finish line had moved another mile down the road. Are we dead? Define dead, Kess replied, running a hand through their hair like they were determining if it was still attached. If you mean existentially, I've been dead inside since we started this gig. That's the spirit, Voss interjected, his toaster contraption still sparking irregularly beside him. But if we're talking physically, then no. I think. Unless this is hell, in which case it's more disappointing than advertised. So, we're alive, Carter said, in the tone of someone who had seriously considered other options. And the blobs, gone, Lynn said, surveying the carnage with the professional detachment of someone assessing a particularly bad piece of modern art, or at least no longer trying to perform their version of human. The musical. Thank God for that, Verlo added, kicking a piece of debris out of his path. I couldn't take another performance of Uncanny Valley. Quillen wished he could bask in the warm glow of their success, but reality, like an old acquaintance who'd overstayed their welcome, had other plans. The chaos might have subsided, but the wreckage remained, scattered about like the aftermath of a neglected New Year's resolution. Right then, let's get this place back in order, he said, trying to sound authoritative, but achieving only the weary resolve of a man who'd been handed the mop after the party ended. Before someone decides to check up on us. Think anyone would want to? Voss asked, wrenching his toaster from the wall with a distinctly unprofessional level of violence. They'd take one look and pretend they saw nothing. Makes their report cards easier. Don't underestimate the power of bureaucracy's nosiness, Kess said, already jotting down notes as if the chaos was a new scientific phenomenon that needed categorizing. Someone's bound to come asking questions, and they'll probably expect sensible answers. That's where you come in, Kess, Lynn said, patting their shoulder. You've got the touch when it comes to explaining the inexplicable. True. I do have a PhD in bullshitting, Kess replied, not missing a beat. But even that might not be enough to explain this circus. Carter, with the look of a man who'd seen a ghost and asked it for directions, nodded. We should start thinking about the cleanup. And maybe skip town, why bother? Verlo asked, dragging a hand through his hair, leaving it standing at a peak. We'll just find more blobs somewhere else. Besides, I've developed a fondness for this hellhole. Stockholm Syndrome, Voss suggested, chuckling as he blew dust off a console. You'll get over it. Let's hope so, Quillen said, tearing his gaze from the mess and focusing on his team. In the meantime, let's see if we can't make this place slightly less likely to kill us. They set to work, their movements filled with the kind of weary determination that only comes from surviving a near catastrophe. The complex, though battered, was still standing, a testament to bad construction and sheer stubbornness. "I'll handle the consoles," Kess said, already tapping away at a control panel with the efficiency of someone who'd rather be anywhere else but knew there were worse alternatives. "I'll deal with power," Voss declared, waving his toaster of doom in a vaguely threatening manner. "It's time these systems learned to play nice," Lynn, meanwhile, busied herself with the tangled mess of wires and panels that had once been a functioning part of the complex. "Reminds me of my last relationship," she muttered, pulling at a stubborn wire. "Messy and liable to electrocute me at any moment." "What about you, Quillen?" Carter asked, watching as the scientist surveyed the wreckage with an air of reluctant acceptance. "Any grand plans? Just trying to figure out how to pitch this as a success story," Quillen replied with a smirk. "We successfully proved that blobs can't replace humans because they suck at improvisation." "Sounds about right," Verlo agreed, straining to realign a bent support beam. "Think they'll buy it? They've bought worse," Kess quipped, adjusting their glasses. "And if not, well, we've got the evidence to back it up." "Here's hoping the evidence doesn't decide to bite us in the ass," Voss said, casting a wary glance at the last shimmers of blob residue. As they worked, the team found themselves slipping back into the rhythm of normalcy, or at least their version of it. There was a comfort in routine, even if the routine involved jury-rigging life support systems and praying that nothing exploded. "Funny, isn't it?" Lynn said, pausing to catch her breath. "How quickly you get used to insanity." "It's a survival mechanism," Carter replied, tossing a ruined piece of equipment aside with a grunt. "Adapt or die, or adapt and die later," Voss added, grinning. "But hey, that's life for you." Quillen, listening to the banter, felt a strange sort of pride in his team. They'd been thrown into the deep end and had managed not to drown, even if they'd swallowed more water than was healthy. "Think we learned anything from this?" Verlo asked, stepping back to admire his handiwork, which looked less like a repair job and more like a modern art installation. "Sure," Quillen said, smiling wryly. "We learned that humans are still better at being human than blobs are." "Reassuring," Kess said, though their tone suggested they were only half joking. "Let's hope it stays that way. And that unpredictability is our trump card," Lynn added, wiping her hands on her trousers with the grim satisfaction of a job half done. "We might be a mess, but we're a creative mess." "Here's to chaos," Carter said, raising an imaginary glass once more. "Our greatest asset and worst enemy." "Drinks after this," Voss reminded them, though he sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than anyone else. "Because I think we've earned it." As they finished their repairs, the complex slowly began to hum with life again, as if waking from a too-long nap. The systems, though still temperamental, grudgingly acquiesced to the team's efforts. "Not perfect," Quillen said, glancing around at the barely contained pandemonium. "But good enough for government work." "High praise," Verlo said with a snort. "You sure you're not angling for a promotion?" "God, no," Quillen replied, genuine terror creeping into his voice. "I might end up in charge of another blob experiment." "Let's not do that again," Lynn said, shaking her head emphatically. "Next time let's try for something less existentially horrifying." "Like what?" Kess asked. "Mindless paperwork." "At least paperwork doesn't try to assimilate you," Carter pointed out. "Usually. Depends on your boss," Voss said, laughing. "But yeah, I could go for boring." "Boring sounds nice." Quillen nodded, feeling the weight of their ordeal slowly lifting. They'd faced a threat that had challenged their very identity, and they'd come out on top, bruised but not broken. "Okay, folks," he said, clapping his hands to get their attention. "Let's wrap this up and head out. We've got drinks to drink and tales of victory to embellish." "Frankly, I think the truth is wild enough," Verlo said, surveying the damage with a critical eye. "But feel free to spice it up. Make us sound like heroes or idiots," Kess said, smiling. "There's a fine line." The team gathered their equipment and made their way out of the cloning complex, leaving behind the chaos, but taking with them an experience that would linger longer than any of them cared to admit. As they stepped into the light of a new day, Quillen paused, glancing back at the amalgamation of wreckage and innovation they'd left behind. Think we'll ever find another place like this? Lin asked, following his gaze. Hope not, Quillen replied, though his smile suggested otherwise. But then again, who knows? The galaxy's full of surprises, yeah, Carter said, slinging an arm around Quillen's shoulders. And if we find it, we'll handle it. Just like we always do, with chaos and a little bit of luck, Voss added, his toaster humming ominously in his hands. Come on, Verlo urged, leading the way forward. We've got a story to tell and a bar tab to start. As they walked away from the complex, their laughter echoed through the stillness, a testament to their survival and their unyielding spirit. Whatever lay ahead, they knew they'd face it together, armed with wit, sarcasm, and just a touch of madness. They'd survived blobs, darkness, and the threat of losing what made them human. And as long as they had each other, they figured, that was more than enough. Here's to tomorrow, Quillen said as they disappeared into the horizon. May it be as insane as today. And with that, the team ventured into the unknown, ready to meet whatever challenges the universe threw their way, confident in the knowledge that they'd always find a way through. After all, they were human, and if there was one thing they'd proved, it was that being human was the wildest ride of all.